Albert Einstein once said, "If you can't explain it to a 6-year-old, you don't understand it yourself." Sometimes technology makes us feel like 6-year-olds, especially when hackers try to use the internet to steal something from each of us. If you think you have nothing of value to a hacker, think again. You and everyone you know are exactly who hackers target every day. This is DIY Cyber Guy with David W. Schrofer. Every week, he will show you how cybersecurity can be as easy as locking up your house at night. Now, here is your host, David W. Schrofer.
Welcome back, everybody, to DIY Cyber Guy. Now, this is the show to listen to stay on top of your online risks. So from hackers to cybersecurity to cryptocurrency, privacy issues, if you understand the risk, it's a lot easier to stay safe. And it's never been easier to listen. We're on almost any podcatcher you can name, including Spotify, which is relatively new for us, but Stitcher, Overcast, Listen Notes, wherever you can find a podcast, that's where you can find us. And please, if you like what you see, just click subscribe wherever you see our show and tell your friends, spread the word. Listening to this podcast is the easiest way to stay safe online. So again, help spread the word if you like what you hear on the show. So with that, let's get on with the podcast. So there was a crime. There were a number of crimes in California back in the 70s and 80s. Recently, the criminal was caught. And the way he was caught probably made the news. You probably heard the term Golden State Killer. And that is an individual, and we don't like to glorify criminals on this show, so I'm just going to call him that, the Golden State Killer, who committed a number of crimes that simply were not solved. Recently, police caught him, and the way that they caught him is the topic of this show today. They caught him with not just his DNA. They had DNA from the crime scenes from back in the 70s and 80s before there was a way to test it. And more recently, they caught him by looking into a website called GED Match. And by going to GED Match, they're able to compare his samples of DNA to other samples. Now, the killer's DNA was not in GED Match, but a relative's DNA was, and that gave the police a lead that ultimately led to his capture. So that begs the question, when you use services like 23andMe or other services to test your DNA and your ancestry and your heritage, what happens to that data? How public is that data? And what are the privacy concerns around that data? Here with me to talk about all of that is Jules Polonetsky. Jules is the CEO of the Future of Privacy Forum, which is a Washington, D.C.-based nonprofit organization that serves as a catalyst for privacy leadership and scholarship, advancing principles of data practices in support of emerging technologies. Jules's previous roles have included serving as Chief Privacy Officer at America Online, and before that, Chief Privacy Officer at DoubleClick, and he was Consumer Affairs Commissioner for New York City. Welcome, Jules.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
So tell me, what happens to your DNA when you put it into a service like 23andMe?
You know, these services, the direct-to-consumer personal genomic services, Ancestry, 23andMe, Habit, Helix, it's really only the last couple of years that these have become really very mainstream. More than 12 million Americans have sent in their DNA for testing, either to learn about their heritage, am I part Native American? Am I part Viking? What can I learn about my background? Or because they're interested in health-related information. Some of these services have been approved by the FDA to do some serious cancer screening tests. Others are providing wellness information. And some of them are even maybe more novelty. What sort of wine might you like based on the genetic information of your taste buds and the like. So really, really popular. What are the privacy consequences? Many people don't think about that, right? I'm sending you my DNA, I'll get a report. Your DNA is a record that can be used to learn an enormous amount of information about you. Obviously, enormous amount of health information. Every month, every week, there's new research focused on genes that let researchers, medical professionals, others learn more. Studies are going on to, try to figure out every possible attribute. That's information that you want treated confidentially.
Sure.
You don't want that falling into the wrong hands. And so we want people as a privacy organization, and frankly, the companies, it's in their best interests. If you're nervous about sending in your DNA, that doesn't work for them. They need you to be comfortable that they're going to treat the data in a secure and a private manner. So we came together with those companies and we said, let's figure out the issues. Can we all commit that no one is going to sell this data? Can we all commit that people have the right to say, delete it? I don't want you to have it anymore.
Okay. And specifically, which companies have made that agreement with the Future of Privacy Forum?
The companies that signed on to the best practices are about 7 or 8. The people we worked with out the door initially were Ancestry, 23andMe, Helix, Habit then joined later,
okay.
Heritage. The full list is at our site, and we're hoping others will join on. But it's basically the 7 or 8 biggest companies. These are all relatively new companies growing very quickly, but the 7 or 8 main companies that most consumers have probably seen or heard from have all participated and are supporting this best practices.
Okay, so let me just stop there for a second. For my listeners, I will have a link in the show notes to the Future of Privacy Forum website, specifically to the article that Jules just mentioned that lists these companies. And I'll also have a specific list of the companies that have signed on to the Future of Privacy Forum's best practices list. And hopefully you can use that. And by the way, tell your friends before you give a DNA sample as a gift or before you use one yourself, any of these services yourself, check the list. Go to DIYcyberguy.com and you'll find the show notes under the episode title, What You Need to Know Before You Test Your DNA. So make sure that any of your friends or relatives who are going to test their DNA, listen to the show and look at the show notes to see the listing of those companies before you do that test.
You know, there are questions that I think consumers want to ask when they send in this test, right? They care about the price, obviously, and they may want to know about the quality and what tests are available. Some companies are only doing ancestry, genealogy type information. Others are doing health. So, you know,
right.
Some do both. So you really need to think about what you want. But the privacy questions that people are going to want to ask are, take a look at that privacy policy. Can I understand it? If it's a super complicated legal document,
right.
who knows what rights you're giving away? So,
and is that one of the points of your best practices to have a, let's call it a human readable privacy practice that doesn't come out as legalese and confusing text?
The companies all agreed to start with a bit of an overview, an easier to read, you know, high level overview. And then if you really want to get into the nitty gritty, great. But let's actually have something basic there where companies can say, I don't sell your data. I may give you the chance to opt in for research or the like if you're interested. I give you rights to delete it. Let's say that right up front. So that's really the first key. Do they do that? The second thing I'd ask is take a look. Can you delete the data? You may have second thoughts 6 months in or a year in. You may say, you know what? I don't want that out there. I don't want, you know, that sort of revealing information in anyone's hands. I'm feeling differently. So do they give you the right to go and terminate your account and get rid of that data and therefore, you know, pull that back? That's clearly important. The other thing I'd look for is, what do they say they're going to do with the data other than send you this test? Are there secondary goals or uses of that data? And if so, are they only going to do those other things with your express permission, right? You don't want to send in data for one purpose and then learn that, you know, who knows what some other company is doing, you know, with this.
So you don't want them to resell it because the company that buys it, as we found out in a completely different circumstance with Cambridge Analytica's use of Facebook.com's data, the original data was sold to a company that sold it to Cambridge Analytica, and now it was used for whatever the heck they wanted to use it for, not the intended.
And the reason these are important is, you know, if you go into a hospital or a doctor, they test your DNA, that's typically covered by the health privacy law, HIPAA, as the experts know it. But when you simply send in your information, you know, as an interesting consumer service,
yes,
making it way more accessible, right? I don't have to, if I simply am interested in this data, I don't have to get a prescription and I don't have to go to the doctor. I may just, you know, be curious or want to be doing research. So it's great that this is accessible. Consumers are interested in, you know, getting a hold of their own data and doing their own research and their own analysis.
Right.
But it's outside that health privacy law. There is one very important law that people are aware, though. There is one very important law that does cover any genetic data, whether it's coming in because of a doctor or insurance or not. We do have a very important law in the US called GINA. And what this law does is it says that an employer may not ask you for this information. It is against the law
for DNA information.
They cannot say, we want to test your DNA before hiring you or after we've hired you. You can imagine an employer wanting to make sure that employees who have maybe some very high health risks, don't join and cause them, higher costs. That is banned. Health insurers and employers, other than in some very extreme circumstances, if you work in forensic DNA and we got to make sure your DNA is not, mixed in with a dead body where you're kind of doing some, research to analyze the remains of a victim or something. Right? Like that's a very,
well, let's call that an extreme example.
You can see why, like that's a place where, but for most of us, that is against the law. But the law doesn't protect other areas, not your employer from accessing this data. And that's why we want to make sure the companies have good policies in place so that that they're going to treat the data confidentially.
Okay, so let me just stop again. That's a really important point. So in a nutshell, if your employer hands you a cotton swab and asks you to swab your cheek and put it in a sealed container of some kind, that's bad. That's against the law.
They are probably violating the law, and you should resist.
Okay, and again, what is the law? You said it was called GINA?
GINA. It's the Genetic Information. I forget the full title of it, but we call it GINA, and it protects employers and health insurers from requesting this information, and certainly it bars any discrimination based on this sort of information.
It doesn't protect them, insurers. It prohibits insurers and employers from collecting that information.
Yeah. Now, okay. It doesn't cover everything, right? Let's think about long-term disability, because there's some very complicated issues here. Imagine if everybody who was considering paying for long-term disability insurance got tested, and anybody who had, any of the markers for high risk, expensive, long-term concerns went and then rushed out. On the other hand, do we want these companies saying, hey, do you want to get long-term care? You better send us your DNA. It seems like these are really hard questions and we need to figure out how to solve them. So the law doesn't protect in every case. And that's why we want to make sure that the companies are making it very clear that they're going to treat the data confidentially.
Perfect. Okay, so for our listeners, I'm going to have a link in the show notes to the Wikipedia page for the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, which, as Jules mentioned, goes under the acronym of GINA. And it's an interesting read. It was passed in 2008, and the entire history, of course, is right here on Wikipedia. So I'll make sure that link is in the show notes. Another page I wanted to show you, and the link to this will be in the show notes as well. We're making a human readable and easy to understand privacy policy is what these companies that signed on to their agreement agreed to. So I went to 23andMe, which you can go to at 23andme.com/privacy, and you'll see this page. And you have a very brief statement. Everybody deserves a secure private place to explore and understand their genetics, et cetera. And then there's a privacy statement. And you'll see at the top of the privacy statement, there's a section called Information We Collect. And there are 3 points there, which seem pretty usable or understandable. It also says exactly how they're going to use the information. And again, there are only 3 data points there. And notice that the third one says, with your consent. So if they use your DNA for research, they will come back to you, and they're explicitly saying they're going to come back to you and get your consent for that. So I would agree with Jules that their commitment of 23andMe and these other companies to have something that anybody can understand is actually being accomplished. So I would encourage you, again, before you use 23andMe or any other site, Ancestry, et cetera, find that privacy page. It's not hard to do, and read it, because it's not the heavy legalese that you might otherwise expect. It's actually written in a way, and Jules and his company probably are to thank for this. It's written in a way that you can understand it. and digest it and understand what they're doing.
Then, as you see, if you actually then want all the detail, because the lawyers do need to give you the details, you can click to see the full privacy statement, and that's where you'll get, all the, real specifics. So we really did think that is important. Important maybe to note about the, the research piece, because, we're a privacy organization, but we're the optimists. I really do think that data, if we have the right protections around it,
yes,
is going to unlock a lot of value for us. We all find, convenience when things are personalized in a way that's useful.
Yes.
But we're creeped out when we don't understand why we're being tracked or targeted. Genetic research is one of the frontiers where, diseases that have so far eluded real cures, hopefully will be unlocked by targeted genetic research, targeted, medicines that will be tailored for you, or will learn how to unlock, the genetic code that turns on and off certain cancers or mutations. So I'm very enthused by it, but I understand that if people don't want to participate, you can't just assume that because you're doing some useful research that it's okay to use people's data. So
right.
23, some of the other
difference between people's data and their DNA data in a sense, because we talk a lot on this show about personally identifiable information. That's first name, last name, address, social security number, and information like that. DNA data is obviously biological data. So that begs the question, do any of these sites allow you to do an anonymous search of the origin, I guess the geographic origin of your DNA? Is this European or Indian or Asian? And come back with that information, X% Asian, Y% African American, or whatever the case may be, without giving personally identifiable information like first name and address?
Your genetic data is by definition personal. It may take some effort to derive the data from the spit that you send in, but the reality is that with the laboratory process, the data that is available can be used to recreate what you look like, can be used to learn an enormous amount about you. So we consider genetic data, even without your name, to be by definition sensitive. There aren't any good ways yet. Maybe there will be in the future. There are researchers working on this, but right now our assumption is that your genetic data, by definition, is a treasure trove of unique data about you.
And even you mentioned wine and whether or not my DNA says anything about my preference of wine, or based on my taste buds, or any other food, or any other marketable dimension. Because that kind of information, I'm more likely to like red wine than white. Any of that information is going to be valuable to marketers on, again, whether we're talking about wine or, choice in the color of Oxford shirts. So if some of that information can be derived from the DNA, have there been any cases of DNA being used for marketing purposes?
Yeah, so, a couple things. One is an issue that probably goes beyond privacy, which is what can you really learn? And there are companies out there promising things that are probably not based on very good science. The academic researchers are looking at some of the claims that some companies make. This will predict whether your kid is going to be a good soccer player. I mean, there's just all kinds of maybe junk science out there. So you want to be skeptical, and you want to stick with the tests that are, increasingly reliable, really predictive. Now, Helix, for example, their business model is to work with different third parties who are working on different kinds of tests. And so you may send in your data, and then they may say to you, there's a new test out. It tries to predict what wine you may be interested in. Evidently some solid research behind that. And you can then sign up for a Wine of the Month Club that is going to send you wine based on the regions you're interested in. So again,
but seriously, if I sign up for that offer, in that case,
you've got to sign up
for Helix. I'm basically agreeing. I'm literally agreeing that Helix can then share my DNA data with that third-party company, that is doing the correlation analyses between DNA samples and regions of red wine that may be tasteful to me.
And then next month, you might learn of another test, learn which sort of, exercise is best for your particular, type or whatever it is. There's new research being done every day that you may want to, but again, it's got to be up to you to decide, yeah, I'm interested in that, offer it to me and use it just for that and nothing more.
So here's where the data handoff problem becomes significant. And again, I'm talking about what we learned about Cambridge Analytica when the company that gave the information to Cambridge Analytica got that information legitimately and legally and per the privacy policy of Facebook. But then they broke that policy when they sold it to a third party. So now, this wine example, again, this other company that's doing testing on DNA to determine what kind of wine you'd like, now you'd have to trust Helix and that third party to keep that information secure. And actually, you'd have to trust another third party for each individual discrete offer that you would get through Helix. Am I hearing?
The good thing is that they don't actually hand off the data. They simply enable, a new kind of test that another party offers.
Okay. But that's important.
But I think it is, you do make a really important point. Every company, that one does business with, right, is always working with different kinds of third parties, right? You might have a cloud provider that hosts your data. You might have somebody who delivers your email. One of the key points in our best practices, and obviously in general responsible privacy and security compliance, is making sure that you've got the right legal promises in place.
Right.
There's all, I've seen over my years as a chief privacy officer, at a number of companies, you've got vendors who reserve rights to use anonymous data or, to make, all kinds of interesting uses of data. So first, getting that legal protection there, and then B, making sure, and this gets to the kind of Cambridge Analytica issue, what process do you have in place? Simply because you have a contract, what process do you have in place to make sure that your vendors are complying, right? You've got to police that, you've got to audit, you've got to have good controls in place, whether it's a partner or whether it's a vendor, to make sure that if you make promises about confidentiality, you have a real solid process in place to make sure you can live up to those commitments.
And you're comfortable that the companies that have signed on to the Future Privacy Forum's guidelines have agreed to having those steps in place?
Yeah, look, this is a new industry, and the important first step was to say to all of them, can we agree that there are some baseline things that even if you have a different business model, you might be doing ancestry, you might be doing health, you might be doing, working with third parties who offer different tests. Can we all get on the same page and really iron out and debate the issues? And we took a lot of input. We've been working in privacy. I've been probably for almost about 20 years now. Some of the companies have some senior folks who've worked on these issues, but we don't have all the wisdom. So we talked to genetics groups who raised issues that I hadn't thought of. We talked to the Federal Trade Commission. We got their input. We talked to folks like some of the privacy and health experts at Consumer Reports. And each of them, gave us some very useful input. And when we went back and we updated our language, and I think at the end of the day, it's a very strong set of commitments. But I'm sure we'll learn new things. These sorts of uses of data, there'll be new and novel issues.
Right.
And the value of it being a best practice. Someone said, don't you need a law? And I said, you know what? I certainly support privacy law. I think the United States needs a comprehensive privacy law. We're one of the only countries in the Western world that doesn't have a comprehensive privacy law. We have laws for banking, we have laws for health, we have laws for student data, but we don't have a general law that says, companies can't sell your data. So we need that. But then we need more detailed, more flexible rules that really target, the nooks and crannies of unique business models. We did 2 years ago an effort around wearables, right? Fitbit has a lot of very interesting data about you. They obviously know how much you exercise.
Sure.
But do you know that the wearables companies know how often you have sex and how long and vigorous that is? Now, whoa, that's some very interesting information that I certainly hope, isn't being used in a way that's broader than I expect, right? There's information that an insurer might want. We've seen law enforcement trying to track missing kids by looking for their Fitbit because your location is being shared. Now, I hope they find the missing kid, but I hope nobody's spouse, is using that to, spy on their, spy on each other and the like.
Sure. Yeah, we've covered a lot of the exercise programs that have inappropriately shared people's data. I think there was the case of the secret military base in the middle of a desert that was exposed because everybody had, it wasn't Fitbit, it was another exercise program. But yeah, you had all these dots and showing all these jog paths in the middle of a place where absolutely nobody should have been, and that was the military base. But I digress. Jules, this has been a fantastic conversation, and again, for our listeners, I hope you share this with anybody that you know that's thinking about doing a DNA test. And if you're interested in privacy, you can certainly go to Jules' website. Jules, where can people find out more about you and the Future Privacy Forum and the work that you guys do?
At fpf.org, you can find information about our work on connected cars, smart TVs, genetics, all the interesting consumer technologies that we are all so interested in, but all of which raise privacy issues that if we handle wisely, we can make sure we get the benefits and we avoid the risk. So fpf.org, on Twitter, LinkedIn, anywhere you search Future Privacy Forum, you'll find us. Okay, folks, Jules officially has the easiest to remember URL of any guest I've ever had, fpf.org. That's as good as it gets, everyone. Jules, thanks so much for being on the show. Thanks. Great to be with you. So that's all the time we have. Remember, we have a free ebook up on our website. That's DIYCyberGuide.com/free. You can also send your questions at questions@DIYCyberGuide.com. And again, it's never been easier to listen. You can download our free podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Player.fm, Stitcher, Overcast, Listen Notes, and also Spotify. And remember, you can buy my book, Digital Habits, on Amazon or Barnes & Noble, or just search Digital Habits 5 on Google. So thanks for listening. And to remind you of a quote that a recent guest gave me, Dr. Meyer Rose, he said, cybersecurity is something you do. It is not something you buy. So I hope this episode helped you to see how easy cybersecurity is to do to keep yourself safe online. Thanks for listening, and come back for our next show.
Thank you for listening to DIY Cyber Guide. The information, opinions, and recommendations presented in this broadcast are for general information only, and we have not knowingly divulged any information that would conflict with any of our non-disclosure or confidentiality agreements. Enjoy the internet safely.